most of you have had this experience that sometimes you are listening to a song and that song really speaks to your emotions in that specific day. So it's an affective experience. This is touching you, but it's also moving you to act. So sometimes you listen to that song and because it's really sad, you also cry, for example, or it's a song that excites you in some sort of way. So it affects you, it moves you to act.
And from Chile, where as you said, we're pretty disheartened currently about the current political process, and where the estallido was, 6 years ago now, and in general, it's pretty hard to even remember that same sense of hope or maybe some of the feelings that were generated during this period and through listening to this music.
Collective, let's say, energy in this case through music is very powerful. The question that becomes evident there is how does it travels from the street, from the square, into more enduring political outcomes.
A lot on the people that we interviewed. So for that reason, what are the positions of your interviews? Are they left-leaning? How do you select them? Did they come from specific political militancies? What kinds of political militancies they come from? Do they come from more older political parties, from newer political parties? Are they independent?
And as you mentioned, among your findings, you have this idea of transhistorical solidarity, solidarity, different forms of belonging. And I was wondering, considering the diversity within the different protesters and the different demands that coexisted at a certain point in time, if you also found dissenting forms of resonance, let's say, dissenting forms of engaging.
Of what does it mean to be dominant, even if you are in this field of protest music, and how they can affect.
It's a wonderful initiative.
The Global South Network opened new horizons for judicial cooperations.
Global South Network provide a platform for meaningful dialogue and cooperation, fostering efforts to build a more equitable and resilient legal landscape.
GSN Network continues to expand areas of activity, further strengthening its impact and reach.
The universal concept of justice compels us to join our efforts, and this is the forum for promoting the same goal.
Well deserved for the hectic activity you have made. I am astonished, I am amazed, I was impressed.
I at the outset commend you, Dr. Ayad, for the immense work that you're doing in the GSN, and the Global South Network is a much admired initiative.
It's commendable. South Network focuses on all disciplines and regions, creating a bridge between academia, full society, legal community, etc.
Quiero expresar mi sincero agradecimiento al Dr. Naumen Riad.
Dr. Naumen Riad, the founder and convener of the Global South Network. His visionary leadership has established a vibrant forum where judges, academics, and practitioners from around the world can share and exchange ideas. Initiatives like today's dialogue allow us to compare jurisprudence, share best practices, and develop common principles. This has the potential to contribute to transnational standards in procedure and enhance administrative law globally.
I would like to point out that Dr. Riad's initiatives have not only enriched comparative judicial dialogue, have also fostered mutual understanding of the diverse challenges that courts face in safeguarding the rule of law and constitutionalism.
We can rule when we want in the cases which are brought to us by citizens and residents. In the EU, this openness of mind is increased by the fact we apply, in some cases, same norms from the EU treaties or the EU directives or regulations.
After all, what would you do as a colonizer from the global north, conditioned by a systemic othering mindset and driven by economic lust built on commodification, including the commodification of human beings?
Everyone, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 50th seminar in phase 4 of the International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress weekly seminar series organized by the Global South Network. I've had the honor and privilege to establish and run it since March 2023. I'm joined by the guest speaker, 2 discussants and 2 peer commentators. Dr. Hillar Carroll is the first discussant for today's session. Dr. Hillar is a feminist historian and has a PhD in Chilean history from the University of Chile. She's an associate professor in the social work department at the University of Chile, where she works in the diversity and gender nucleus intersectional feminist approaches. She is also the coordinator of the Masters in Gender and Culture Studies at the University of Chile. As a researcher and professor, she works on topics related to gender, sexualities, feminism, violence, oral history, and memory in the context of Chilean and Latin American recent history. She is the primary researcher on the state-financed Fondicate project titled Gendered Constitutional Debates and Paradoxical Citizenships in Chile, 20-21st Centuries. Dr. Natalia Morales Cerda recently completed her PhD at the Faculty of Law, University College London. She is the second discussant for today's session. Her doctoral research examines conceptions of political representation and their impact on constitutional democracy. She is currently a postdoctoral research fellow and an associate lecturer at University College London, Faculty of Law. Pablo Santibanez Rodriguez is the first peer commentator for this session. He is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Education, University College London. His ongoing PhD project investigates the role of social movements in education and their transformative potential in modern educational contexts. Benjamin Concha Gonzalez is the second peer commentator for this session. Benjamin is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Social and Historical Sciences, University College London. His ongoing PhD project titled The Reconstruction of a Polis and Intellectual History of the Concept of Democracy in Chile from 1990 till 2023 examines the different conceptions of democracy among the left, center, and right-wing parties that led the Chilean transition to democracy between 1990 and 2023. Finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today's seminar, Daniela Fazio Vargas, who have recently completed her PhD in sociology at the University of Manchester. Congratulations. In her PhD thesis, she explored the political significance of music in the context of the 2019 Chilean Uprising. She has participated in initiatives of knowledge exchange with the British Council. Today, Daniela will present part of her PhD project titled The 2019 Chilean Uprisings as an Oasis of Resonance, Collective Vibrations, and the Experience of Dissenting Sounds. She will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, followed by 5 to 10 minutes of comments from our discussants. If time permits, we will then open the floor for a 15-minute question and answer session with the audience. So Daniela, we are delighted to have you with us today. The screen is now yours.
So thank you so much for the introduction. As I said, I'm going to talk about my PhD, which I recently completed. And as you said, my research focused on the role of music in the 2019 Chilean social uprising. But before starting, I would like to give a bit of a personal introduction of why this topic was interesting to me. So I was born in Colombia, and I grew up in Colombia listening to Chilean music. And this was not a coincidence. This was not a coincidence because actually my father is Chilean. And for various reasons, tied to political reasons, he had to leave the country. Well, my entire family had to leave the country during the 70s. And he found my mom, he got married, and I was born from that relationship. But I grew up listening to this music, and that's why this topic for me is more than my PhD, is part of my personal history. And I found in music as a way to connect with my family past. So if I get excited, maybe it's because of that reason, apart because that I think that my PhD is really interesting, and I hope you will find it too. And as you also said when doing the introduction, I hope that other researchers studying different realities can also find here points of connection. So having said that, I'm going to start. And I slightly changed the title, but here the concepts, the same concepts are still central. I'm going to be talking about music, I'm going to be talking about protest, and more specifically, I'm going to be talking about an idea that became central throughout my PhD, that is the concept of aesthetics. So I'm going to be talking about these different ideas, but because I know that most of the discussants know about Chile, but I also know that there are members from the audience that are not familiar with what happened in the 2019 Chilean social uprising. I thought it was good to start with a brief context of what happened in this protest that I'm studying. And this also connects with the fact that, as I said, I was born in Colombia and I actually didn't participate in this protest. But when I was in Colombia, the same songs were being sung in the protests that we had, more or less at the same time that in Chile. So I was really interested in understanding why this happens and what is the role of music in sustaining political transformation. And in fact, this became one of the main purposes from my PhD. So what happened in the 2019 Chilean social uprising? Basically, it was a wave of protest whose strongest wave lasted 6 months, from October 2019 till March 2020. And this protest sparked by an apparently insignificant issue that it wasn't insignificant at all, but it was a small increase in the metro fare. And this increase was deeply felt by the Chilean population, and the students were the first that started to mobilize. But they were quickly joined by other protesters, feminist movements asking for better pensions, for better healthcare, movements from gender and indigenous minorities. They all were claiming for a life that was worth living. And this is especially important because I have here this image. This in fact became one of the mottos from the protest I am studying, that they were saying is not 30 pesos, referring to the increase in the metro fare. They were saying is 30 years, referring to the consequences of the dictatorship, and basically related to the introduction of the neoliberal regime that resulted that in Chile everything is privatized, from education to the access of water. So these protests were known because of these different sectors of the populations participated as a social uprising, and they were also characterized by different factors. One of these factors was, unfortunately, violence and a lot of state repression. But another factor that I was really interested was that it was also an artistic outburst, not only because many artists participated in the protest actively, but also because many demonstrators resorted to art to demonstrate themselves. So there was a lot of cultural explosion and creativity in this protest, and this in fact resonates, as you mentioned at the beginning, with trends happening in other countries. For example, in the Arab Spring, we also see that art was central, and these creative explosions were something that we can also see that is something more transnational and has echoes beyond this Latin American reality. So apart from these artists participating in the protest, it was also characterized by improvised stage where artists were trying to support and accompany this protest through music, also musicians mingling with the protesters. Even the symphonic orchestra participated in the protest, performing in the streets, so disrupting this canon by playing this music in a setting that was different from the ones they usually perform. performances, also tributes to musicians like Victor Jara, who was murdered during the dictatorship, even reappropriations from old songs, and especially from one song from Victor Jara that became a symbol from the protest I'm studying, that is known, that is called The Right to Live in Peace, El Derecho de Vivir en Paz. So new songs, new creations, but also reappropriations of music, and especially from songs, and from songs from a very specific time, and it's the time of La Unidad Popular, from the government that was before the dictatorship, where culture was also central, and especially music became part of that political project as well. So as I said, I was really interested, and this became one of my research objectives in my thesis, to understand the aesthetic element of protest, how protests become sites of aesthetic events, how protests are aestheticized in general terms. But I also had an interest in understanding what was the specific role of music in sustaining political transformation, and especially in sustaining this political transformation in a context where there were many institutional setbacks. And I think this is important to be mentioned now, not only because of what happened this weekend in Chile of the presidential elections, that I think connects really well with this uprising, and in fact the connections are still clear, but also because one of the expected outcomes from this protest I was studying was to transform the constitution that was written during the time of Pinochet, during the time of the dictatorship. And the constitution, there was what's the name? Constitutional Assembly and 2 referendums, but they didn't change the constitution. So in fact, this protest, for some of the interviewees I had the chance to speak with, they were talking about this as a failure. And in the scholarship, sometimes there are scholars that talked about these acts of revolution, even in the Arab Springs, like Asef Bayat, as failed revolutions. But if we look to them from this micro perspective, there is a lot of transformation, even political transformation. And I was interested in understanding that. And I saw in music as a way to try to conceptualize what this political transformation could be. So as I said, those were the 2 main objectives of my research. And for that, I draw inspiration in, of course, social movement scholarship. But because I studied philosophy, I found that aesthetic theory could give me another way through which study these concepts and through which understand these ideas of political transformation, because part of my argument derived from saying that the political transformation lied in transforming the aesthetics. So actually, I wanted to ask questions, but because I'm not seeing you, I'm just going to skip that part. So basically, usually when I ask these questions when I'm presenting, I usually start by asking to the audience what they think that is aesthetic. And most of them usually link it to something that is visual or pleasant to the eye. And people are right. Usually aesthetic is linked to these beautiful landscapes or artistic pieces that do not leave us untouched. And this concept gained a lot of prominence in the 19th century, in fact, related to this experience of art that was just for the sake of the experience, not because there was another purpose beyond that. So I was really interested in understanding how aesthetics and the aesthetic theory could help me to understand this political transformation. And for this, I argued in my research that protests are also spaces for aesthetic experiences. And this was very interesting because usually, as I said, the concept of aesthetic experiences have been linked to these beautiful landscapes, museums, spaces of beauty. And I was trying to bring this concept to an adverse place that are the contexts of a protest, where there is no beauty, but chaos, where there is violence, where there is disorder. So I was trying to bring this idea to this arena of contention. And for that, I found inspiration not only, as I said, on the classic aesthetic theory from philosophy, but I was mainly interested in rescuing 2 senses of the idea of aesthetics. One that is more related to the etymology of the word aesthetics, and aesthetics actually has to do with the senses. With aesthesis, it is the word in Greek, and it relates to sensorial perception, basically what you perceive with your 5 senses. But there have been other developments in understanding this idea, mainly from philosophy and especially from the philosophy of Jacques Rancière. And he talks about aesthetics in two different registers. One is the way we think about art and how that is informed by our sensorial perception. And whenever we can change the way we think about art, we're in front of a transformation of the aesthetic regime. But also another notion of aesthetics that he ties to politics, and more specifically to this distribution of the sensible that he talks about that can be redistributed to create something new. So I was getting inspiration from these different theoretical traditions that have conceptualized this idea of aesthetics, and I was trying to understand how, as I said, the protest could be spaces for aesthetic experiences. And I have here this quotation by German sociologist Hartmut Rosa, and he talks about aesthetics experiences as these experiences of transcendence, where subjects are really absorbed in the moment of the experience, leaving something meaningful in them after they experience this. So he talks about experiences of greater awareness. Even he uses the same notion of resonance, is when you resonate with the word, in having this different experience that will transform you, not only you, but it will transform the world around you. So as I said, I was getting inspiration from this idea, and for that I want to use this video. I'm just going to show the 1 minute, if that's okay. 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 So I wanted to show this video because I think it not only it's a very beautiful way of saying how music was present in the protest I was studying, but specifically the example I chose. It is a song that is called El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido, which is from the 70s actually, and it was created to support Allende, the president from the Unidad Popular. But this song gained a lot of new significance and a new meaning, when the dictatorship arrived, and then it has been reappropriated in many times, not only in Chile but also abroad. Even in the UK, people sometimes have sung this song during protests, and I even know a version in Farsi that was sung during the protest in Iran. So it's a song that has traveled quite a lot. But I wanted to show you that video because I think it really captures the presence of music, but also this same idea of aesthetic resonance that I want to explain now, and that is another of these concepts that is a key in my research, and especially in one of the chapters I'm gonna discuss today. So this idea of resonance, the same idea of resonance is tied to music, and especially to turning forks, for example, whose proximity leads one to resonate to the other's movements, is related to vibration, physical vibration. And I think you could see in this example of the video I just showed, the physical vibration of people singing together. But it's not only this physical vibration of sound traveling through the space, of bodies vibrating because they are next to each other, but it's also an affective experience. It's an aesthetic experience of resonance. And for this, my research, of course, engages with social movement scholarship, and the concept of resonance has been widely used by frame scholars, more specifically when talking about process of same alignment. So, for example, when the message from a protest aligns with the perspective of a bystander, and that bystander, after seeing that, decides to join the protest because there was an alignment there, a resonance in these terms of ideas that can be aligned. But resonance has also been conceptualized differently in sociology as these moments of belonging where people, because they are vibrating together, even with strangers, that can feel they belong to something. It's a responsive relationship with themselves, but also with the others. But I was more interested in understanding this idea of resonance as connected with this idea of aesthetic experience. So Rosa develops this idea of aesthetic resonance in one of his most famous books, and he identifies different characteristics of these experiences. So basically, are experiences that touch you in a certain way. I think most of you have had this experience that sometimes you are listening to a song, and that song really speaks to your emotions in that specific day. So it's an affective experience. It is touching you, but it's also moving you to act. So sometimes you listen to that song, and because it's really sad, you also cry, for example, or it's a song that excites you in some sort of way. So it affects you, it moves you to act, it transforms you in a certain way, but it's also on experiences. There are also, experiences that are completely unavailable. So I think you also had the experience where you are looking to that song many times on your Spotify or any platform you use, and that song is not going to speak you again. Why? Because these aesthetic experiences cannot be predicted, cannot be induced, but they can happen. And when they happen, are deeply transformative. So as I said, I was trying to understand how these ideas of aesthetics can help me to understand protest, and more specifically, the political transformation that a protest could bring. So for this, and this is going to be more materialized now, what I did was to conduct my fieldwork in Chile in 2023. And of course, because my project was about music, one of my main sources were songs that were created during the uprising, songs that were reappropriated during the protest. But something that I need to say, I really love music, but I'm not a musicologist, so I couldn't analyze all these songs from more the melodic arrangements. I focus more on the lyrics, so I know that's a limitation of my research, but I thought it was good to be honest and say it and recognize it at the beginning. Because I was also interested in the experience beyond the songs, I also conducted some interviews, and as you can suspect, most of them were artists and most of them were musicians. Musicians from all the different genres you can imagine, from folk music to heavy metal, rock, psychobilly, different genres that were, and musicians that were engaged in the protest. And because my research has also to do with arts, I also employed some creative methods, basically two methods that I included in my research. One is, I don't know if you have heard this term, sonic postcards. And it's basically, I wanted to understand all the sonic elements that were happening at the time of the protest, because I wasn't there. So I started to ask the participants if they had to take a picture from the uprising, but instead of including images, they would include sounds, what sounds they would include. So that helped me to get a bigger perspective of the other sounds involved in the protest. And I think this is relevant because, as you may imagine, listening to music in the context of a protest is not the same as listening to these songs when you are in your house with the privacy of your headphones or in a concert hall, because there is a lot going on. So all these sounds, I was very interested in understanding what they were and how they were impacting the experience or the aesthetic experience of music. And because I conducted my fieldwork in 2023, I also used some exercises of music elicitation, where I played some song recordings to talk with my interviewees about their memories of this music and about the memories about the protest. So basically, these are, in a very brief way, the methods I used for my research. And as I said, I'm going to present today some of the findings I included in the last chapter of my PhD research, where I examine precisely protest as resonant events that, as I'm going to talk through in these 10 minutes that I still have, can produce some sort of solidarity. So as I said, the idea of resonance I introduced at the beginning has to do with this vibration that is physical, also with the establishment of these bonds that make you feel belonging, that make you feel that you are part of this community, even if you do not know the people that you are singing with, for example. And so something that was very interesting about the protest I was studying was that many people said that music, and that's why they remembered music as being deeply transformative, was help them to create these bonds with people they didn't know. And they were saying that one of the most impressive things, for example, this journalist mentioned that one of the most impressive things for them about the protest was, of course, the reevaluation of the entire movement of La Nueva Canción Chilena, that is the music movement that emerged at the end of the 60s and is quite tied to the government of Salvador Allende. The act of El Canto para una Semilla was beautiful. There is from Violeta Parra, one of these musicians, also linked to La Nueva Canción Chilena. There were many musical acts, and El Pueblo Unido, that is the song from the video I just showed you, was obviously sung, and it was exhilarating for me. But more than remembering particular songs, my memories about the public space, having found that we were listening to music, enjoying, smiling, meeting friends, and hugging. So this was, in fact, an idea that was quietly repeated when I was doing my interviews, and it was how the protest, and more specifically the collective concerts of the protest, were occasions to connect with people that before were anonymous. To connect with people, to make new friends, and even some of them actually used words that denote familiarity. They talked about meeting sons, nephews, aunts, uncles in the protest while singing to this music. And I think, once again, this is interesting, but before going to this second quotation, this is interesting also in the same context of the protest. As I said, they were saying that they were trying to challenge the 30 years tied to the dictatorship, and more specifically to the neoliberal regime. So most of them were talking about the problems of neoliberalism. They really emphasized this idea of individualism. So creating this solidarity through music, where you can connect with other people, was a way for them to fight this individualism. So I'm going to read the second quotation. They were saying, El estallido was fundamental because it changed my life as a musician, and I made people, I'm just reading what it's in bold, who, if I had not been for the outbreak, I would never meet. So they were talking about quite often of how this collective singing fostered this kind of sonic solidarity, making them connect with people that otherwise will remain anonymous to each other. I'm just going to skip that. But another interesting idea was it was not only creating solidarity in the present, it was not only creating solidarity with fellow protesters that were at the same time singing the same songs, but another idea that was quite often mentioned during my interviews was that it was also a way to create a sort of transhistoric solidarity, seeing in music as a vehicle through which establish bridges specifically with a moment of history that was the time of La Unidad Popular. And I think it's quite, this image, I found it that is so beautiful. So this is Salvador Allende, and behind him, there is this sign that says there is no revolution without songs. And as I said, the government of Salvador Allende that preceded the dictatorship and was ousted during the dictatorship saw in arts, in culture in general, but specifically in music, as a vehicle of transformation. So many of the musicians I interviewed, they were saying, by the same act of reappropriating these songs, it is a way to connect with history and to create this solidarity with the movements from the past, movements that are still present today, that are still relevant today. So this connection with history was quite emphasized during my interviews. And the same idea of resonance that Harmut Rosa develops is tied to this idea of being covered by this mantle of history, where you are not only resonating with the people around you, you are not only resonating with yourself, but you are also resonating with the world and with the history that you belong. So they were saying, I'm just going to read this. The songs establish a bridge with history, though the dictatorship attempt to tear everything down, with Victor Jara or Violeta Parra, that are two main exponents or symbols from this Nueva Canción Chilena movement. Once again became the people of Chile that started to sing these songs and that linked them to the history of Chile. So that's why, like a second part of my chapter, developing this idea of protest as a state of resonant events, I was trying to understand how these songs actually connected them with this past that was still present for them. But it was also something that it was not merely a nostalgia, because many of these musicians were saying, we are not only connecting with the culture of La Unidad Popular, as it's written here, Some of them even were saying the collective concerts of the protest are occasions where to create something new, also related to this idea of the societies that they were aiming for. So it was a past that was not in the past, was still present, and it was also connected with the future. Most of them were aiming for. So that's why I tried to talk about this idea of how music created this solidarity that, as I said, is not only solidarity in the present with these other protesters, but it's also this solidarity with different historical time. And they saw in music as the vehicle where to connect with that other time, what was still relevant. So I'm gonna read this final quotation, and I know that I need to conclude because I only have 3 minutes. But they were saying that singing, us sitting in the square and listening, stand up, sing, we're going to succeed. That is a verse from the song I played in the video. Jan-Dec came back to life for me. For me, it was very nice. We took photos of everyone excited, from the child to older people. And my partner said, I finally thought that I could die in peace. So this is, just to conclude, was tied with this idea of seeing in music and in these collective concerts also occasions where to prefigure or create the futures they were aiming for, were bringing about this idea of a hope for change. And it was also like an idea, this idea was quietly emphasized during my protest, during my project, sorry. So as just to conclude, I was really interested in understanding the protest from this aesthetic perspective, more specifically trying to understand not only how protests can be aestheticized, how they can become sites that can be seen, can be perceived, but also how they can also be occasions for aesthetic experiences. And these aesthetic experiences that as I said, are these deeply transformative moments that are out of the ordinary, moments that transform us in a particular way. These are occurrences that might happen in a very short time span, but that leave us an impact. So I was trying to bring this idea to a context that might seem adverse, that is the context of a protest. And I developed this idea through the different chapters of my thesis, understanding how protests could be aesthetic events, but also how they can be resonant events. Resonance that can teach us, teaching us about these powerful connections that can create transformative affinities that in my own research I conceptualize under this idea of solidarity. Solidarity, as I said, with the other protesters through the establishment of these strong connections that I have here, but also creating these affective experiences that transform us, even making us critically think about our own biographies and even connect with history. So that's why I developed this idea of sonic solidarity, but also of transhistorical solidarity, trying to understand how through music protesters saw a way to connect with these different moments of history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniela, for such a fantastic, insightful presentation. What I'm going to do is I will collect comments from discussants and peer commentator one by one, and you may wish to take notes, and then in the end you can give a brief response. So without much ado, let's go to Dr. Hillar. Dr.
Hello,
Hillar,
yes, can you hear me? Thanks, Daniela, for that great presentation. I looked over the presentation earlier when they sent it to me. And I guess my questions, as I was thinking about this, and from Chile, where as you said, we're pretty disheartened currently about the current political process, and where the estallido was, 6 years ago now, and in general, it's pretty hard to even remember that same sense of hope or maybe some of the feelings that were generated during this period and through listening to this music. So I guess my first question has a little bit to do with that in terms of, you said your fieldwork was in 2023, and so that would be post September 4th rechazo vote, which changed, I think, a lot of the way that we thought about aesthetics and social movements and estallido. And so I was wondering a little bit if you could talk about maybe any reflections that you had regarding that, or even that your interviewees might have had regarding that, because I think that memory, as I work on memory as well, and with regard to even, I think a lot of what we were thinking about in terms of this music and memory and recent history, and of course, this relationship to Allende and the Unidad Popular, I think that later on, maybe when we reflected about that, post-rechazo, we've come to some different conclusions and some different reflections. So my first question has to do with that. My second question, since I also am kind of specialized more in gender, sexualities, and feminism, is of course, I wanted to talk a little bit more about as well those aspects related. You talked a little bit about las tesis, and so I was wondering as well how much that factored into your research as well, as that was like a huge movement here as well, based on performance, based on aesthetics, based on a lot of, feminist theory and practice here. And we also wrote an article on that, me and some other scholars, related to thinking about transitional feminist justice and how we can think about that as related to las tesis, which also included not just women, but also members of the LGBTQ community. So I was wondering as well how much as well this aesthetic, because when we think about, all the songs and aesthetic and what had to do with like the Allende years, that's kind of an aesthetic that's pretty heteronormative, and it's pretty related to like traditional masculinities. So I'm wondering as well, like if you saw through las tesis any like disruptive qualities, or maybe as well moments where there was kind of like put into tension or conflict as well, like these different aesthetics and this relationship with song or with music. Because, for example, I was even thinking there was a lot of other types of music that also came out, like urban music, rap, hip hop, etc. And not just like the traditional like Anita Tijoux, but also like Luanco, Make Me Jedi, that also had a couple songs that also came out at this time. And you could say that, well, that's pretty different as well, from that other kind of more traditional aesthetic. So I guess that would be my second question. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Hilary. It was very useful. Let's go to Natalia. Natalia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. I really enjoyed the presentation. I didn't have the chance to say it before, so it's coming out of the spot. Well, I'm coming from a law background, so my expertise on comparative constitutional law mainly. So I will try to offer maybe kind of a more like a legal lenses to see what you are studying, and maybe to eventually to try to provide, if it's useful for you, like an additional vocabulary to use on to what you are already developing. And the thing element is the idea, obviously, of I think it's quite common to approach this process through the lenses of constituent power, right? The idea of constituent power, and I think that from that lenses, Chile is a very unique case in the way that obviously the discussion was not about policy reforms, but it was a discussion about constitutional authorship, right? Who gets basically to remake the political agreement, right? That's the idea of to creating a new constitution. Who is going to speak? Who is going to be involved in creating a new constitutional agreement settlement, right? And in constitutional theory, we usually try to make a distinction between constituent power, meaning the ordinary powers that are working under the existing constitution, and constituent power, right? The idea that who has the authority to create or recreate a new constitutional order, right? So I assume that what your interviewees describe can be read as a way of constituent articulation, in the way that they are developing music, creating new music, and in that way, music, I think, helps to produce shared, like that we can say that we are here and we have a claim on the future. That's basically, as we see it from constitutional law perspective on constitutional theory, that's basically a claim of constituent articulation. So, and that matters because constitutional theory or most traditional approaches to constituent power usually assumes that the people, like the subject of constituent power, is already there. Already, it's something that we can see, that it's there as a unified subject in a way. But I think that your evidence suggests something that is maybe more dynamic in the way that collective subjects are made in practice through, in this case, music, right? And in a way, there are more like repeated or maybe an idea of embodied forms of participation. And in that sense, I think that from the law perspective, we could see music not only as a meaningful, culturally meaningful, but also as politically productive, right? But there is from the law perspective, there is a tension there. There is a legal tension in a way that I think that your work could speak to or could be useful to maybe to talk about this tension. Because even when collective, let's say, energy, in this case, through music is very powerful, the question that becomes evident there is how does it travels from the street, from the square, into more enduring political outcomes. And this, I'm thinking about my own work in Chile, and where I argue that, okay, social movements can be understood not just as actors that are influencing, that can influence in constitutions, but they can also work as a constituent actors. I mean, they can create a constitution, right? They are not only influencing, they're not going to influence, for instance, only judicial decisions. They're not going to influence only in courts, but they're also able to influence as authors of a constitution, right? However, you need some sort of mediation in order to that to happen. That is to say, and that's the problem of constituent theory, you need some sort of political representation in democratic constitutionalism in order to work. So if you need that idea of political representation, then it's how do you do that translation from music to, and obviously I'm not talking about political parties, or not necessarily political parties. I'm talking more about relational practices, maybe. That's probably, it's coming from something more on your research. And so how do you do that translation from the street to enduring political outcomes in a way? And I think that's the problem of, or maybe that's the problem of constituent theory, that if you look at from your research, I think that we can find some maybe similarities, and you could actually talk about it to more legal audiences in a way.
Great, thank you, Natalia, for your comments. Pablo, over to you.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks, Daniela. I think it was really interesting, and it was a really interesting presentation. I think that you are adding something different to the conversations about protests in Chile, about the estallido. I think that you are not just describing cultural practices of the movements, but you are also trying to grasp some of their doings within the Protestant movements. And I think that's something new, and it connects with a lot of literature in social movements research lately, from the Arab Springs, from the Occupied Wall Street. I think it's adding something new, and can be, and I can see the connections with that. Before raising I have three questions. What is related with your framework, with your connections between frame theory and resonance? The second one related with how you selected the participants and the interviews. How was your field work? And perhaps a third one that connects a little bit with what Hillar said, that is about your reading of this specific chapter after 6 years of the protest, because of those previous two questions. I think my background and the questions emerge from social movement research. I'm much more interested in the long-term significance of movements, memory, long-term significance, things like that. And at the same time, as a Chilean and as a politically engaged researcher, I was there. I took part on the protest. I come from a similar background to yours, so my questions come from that context. So my first question is the people that you interview. One of my favorite books about the estallido is Manuel Canales, that speaks about the open questions of the estallido. We're still trying to grasp what's the estallido about. So the readings that we can have about the estallido depends a lot on the people that we interview. So for that reason, what are the positions of your interviews? Are they left-leaning? How you select them? Did they come from specific political militancies? What kinds of political militancies they come from? Do they come from more older political parties, from newer political parties? Are they independent? Connected with that, did they have experience in previous protests? Did they have previous experiences in the protest or in political projects? Did they have experience in the popular unity? Did they have experience in the fighting for democracy? Did they have experience in the student mobilizations? Or the 2019 is a new experience, and it's like the first original experience in protest. The second one, with frames, is basically, I think that it's really interesting how you discuss the idea of alignment with resonance. As many frame theory says, frame theory, rather than looking for understanding frames, look about the framing process of protest. Who is trying to understand and produce a meaning about the specific protest in a specific way? So related to that, these specific events that you explore, what kind of meanings, goals, or demands are they fostering about the estallido? What kind of goals, demands, specifically are they producing and trying to foster, again, with this idea of the open question about the estallido, that we're still trying to grasp where the estallido comes. And the third one, it's perhaps a little bit more, I've been trying to think how to organize this question, but I come from a similar background to you. I grew up listening to Quilapayún, Inti Yimani, my family is left-leaning, etc. But one of the main critiques to some groups within the estallido is that they foster a self-representation process within the estallido. Rather than opening the meanings to represent huge parts of the population, they enter within the estallido, and they, because of their history, because of their background, because of the way that the democratic process was designed, because how forgetting the violation of human rights was a rule for our democracy in order to build it again, they find it in this place a moment of self-representing, and all this kind of messiness was like framed in a particular way. So my question is, to what extent your chapter, rather than being a chapter about how aesthetics are used to redistribute the possible, as Francier says, are rather trying to fix the possible just by a specific political group. So those are my three questions.
Great, thank you, Pablo. Benjamin, go to you.
Thank you, Daniela. That was a great presentation, and congratulations on your PhD and your research project. I think it's really original, and it really sheds new light into El Estallido. So I wanted to ask three questions as well. The first one is regarding all the songs that you studied, both the more well-known ones, but also the new ones that were also created during the process. Did you find, or could you trace different moments of emergence of those songs? For instance, El baile de los que sobran, El derecho de vivir en paz, but also other songs, were they correlated with specific moments of the protest? And if so, how do you interpret that? The second question is about the concept of resonance. And as you mentioned, among your findings, you have this idea of transhistorical solidarity, sonic solidarity, different forms of belonging. And I was wondering, considering the diversity within the different protesters and the different demands that coexisted at a certain point in time, if you also found dissenting forms of resonance, let's say, dissenting forms of engaging with the different demands. And finally, I was also wondering, what's your definition of music? I think it's very interesting how you describe how music is being played, enacted, performed at a, let's say, non-traditional venue, but you also use the word and the concept of musicking, right? So I think that could also expand our concept of music. Thank you very much again.
Great. Thank you, Benjamin, for your comments. Daniela, all said, all done. The ball is now in your court. You don't need to answer every question. Just brief response, because you know this process is an endless process. Even if you publish book, there will still be some comments there. So yeah, please feel free to not answer question or answer the question. Entirely up to you.
So thank you for your questions, your comments, and it's very nice to have them from different perspectives, because that really helps me to think further about my project. And as you were just saying, I think the PhD is just the beginning. So having this legalistic perspective, more the feminist one, from the social movements perspective, they all give me new ideas. So thank you for that. So I'm gonna try to answer to some of them. I'm going to start with the last question, because I think from that I can build and develop to the others. So yeah, my definition of music is not the traditional definition of music. And that's why I also found Francier really inspiring, because I was trying to define the same notion of what music could be and who could be a musician in the context of a protest. Because it is not only the artist that is recognized, that is playing music, that is creating music, but music is also the banging of pots and pans at some point. Music is also the dog passing by. All that makes part of the sound experience. And that's why, well, Christopher Small is the one who develops this idea of musicking, trying to grasp this more collaborative element that is present in the music creation, that is active, is not an object, is the activity of participating in this music creation. So I said I wanted to start with that, because I think that can also help me to cover some of the questions that Pablo and Hilary mentioned, and especially and that also has to do with the artist I got access to. So most of my sample, I will say, even if I thought at the beginning that most of the interviews I was going to conduct were going to be interviews to students, I ended up having the opposite. So my sample is quite old, if we could use that word in a very respectful way. And most of the people I interviewed and the artists were actually connected in a certain way to either La Nueva Canción or El Canto Nuevo. So it's true. They are talking about one narrative, they are talking about one way of creating music, and that really informs the way they perceive the other music. And in fact, in other chapter, I discuss this idea of how for them, for example, the urban music that was being created, for them that was not political. And that was interesting, because they were trying to say, we really need to change the distribution of the sensible, we really need to change society, but they were, in a certain way, we can use the word conservative in the way they were perceiving music. Because for them, real political music was protest music from the time of the 60s, from La Unidad Popular, and they were disregarding, in a certain way, these new creations that came from more marginal groups or new ways of creating music. So in another chapter of my thesis, I really speak to that tension of what does it mean to be dominant, even if you are in this field of protest music, and how that can affect the way you are considering these other forms of music creation. So Rancière has this idea that politics comes from the margins, but it's really hard to say that that is happening in Chile when even these artists are not in the margins. These artists are dominant in the field of protest music. So I think that helps me to address somehow your question about like the feminist artists and your question about self-representation. And also, Natalia, thank you so much for bringing that vocabulary. That I think it's really helpful. And especially I was interested in understanding this political transformation, not from a legalistic point of view, more in fact, I was trying to challenge, to say that politics not only occurs in these traditional spaces, but of course, that question about how we can translate what happens in the streets, how we can translate the grassroots activism or the social movement transformation into politics that have a real effect, if we can say it, or not a real effect, but an effect in a more traditional or legalistic way, how we can really bring about all this music to prevent a result like the one we saw last week. So I think those questions are really valid. And I think that the word you use of how we can travel from one side to the other, I think that is the big question that we all have, and especially we all have when working on social movements, how we can really transform society. So thank you so much, and thank you for all your questions.
Great. Thank you, Daniela. Any questions from the audience? So thank you very much, Daniela, for such an insightful and stimulating presentation. Your work makes a valuable contribution to the broader discussion on music, movements, narratives, political discourse, and it has given us much to reflect on. So my heartfelt thanks also go to our excellent discussants, Dr. Hillar and Dr. Natalia, and peer commentators Pablo and Benjamin for their thoughtful and engaging feedback, and to everyone who joined us today for your participation and support. The Global South Network warmly welcomes PhD students from all disciplines and from every corner of the world to share their research and receive interdisciplinary feedback. And this seminar is a very good example. If you are interested in presenting your work or taking part in a future session, please contact me at leak@leaksn@gmail.com. This seminar was the last seminar of the Phase 4 January to December weekly PhD in Progress seminar series. The network is going to take a break till 14th of January, and on 14th of January, the Phase 5 January to December 2026 will begin. Until then, take care, look after yourself, have a wonderful day, have a great Christmas, Happy New Year in advance. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you once again for being with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for all the comments. Thank you so much. Thank you.